I think the most important people in architectural culture right now, in terms of theory, are from outside of architecture. Sanford was trained in comparative literature, not in architecture. But to my mind, the key people, and that would include Mark Cousins, Manuel Delander, Ben Bratton, and Sanford himself, are from outside architecture. The key person from within inside architecture, I would say, is Michael Hayes. And one thing I share with Michael Hayes is the necessity to engage with those discourses from outside architecture. When he produced his reader, Architecture Since 1968 or something like that, he included some of the texts that I included. My point, though, in Rethinking Architecture is that none of the texts are written by architects. Not a single one is written by an architect. And the idea is that you need this kind of critical discourse from outside to destabilize the cozy hegemony of architectural thinking. We need to keep it alive in a critical way. And I know that there are lots of different sort of views of theory. When I was teaching in Dessau, one of my students who had been studying in Egypt said, when I was teaching Rethinking Architecture, and he said, back in Egypt, we look at Neufert. That's our architectural theory. Now, Neufert, architectural theory? I don't know. I mean, I think
that's a very classical French definition of theory, right? That's
I don't know. I come from the kind of critical theory background, but having said that, many of the thinkers were in Rethinking Architecture are either German or French. And I gave a lecture once in Germany, and I was invited to Stuttgart, and I thought I'd talk about German thinkers, Adorno and Benjamin and Zimmel and Krakauer, and they were looking at me like I was from a different planet because they don't talk about those things in architecture school in Germany. I think it's really important. So anyway, so the three things. Okay, let's try and get the auditing students to have a voice. It's really important to my mind, and I'm really grateful that you guys have been following. Secondly, there's Rethinking Architecture there on the Discord thing, and I hope that those auditing students can join as well. And thirdly, I forget what the third point was. So how are we doing in terms of numbers? We're almost, I'll just hold on a little longer, Marrikka, before you start. Thirdly, importance of Sanford Kwinter. I mean, so Antonio's comment on WeChat was to say, oh, forget the debate between Peter Eisman and whoever, and this was the important one. And actually, looking back on it, it was really a terrific debate. And I think the key issues you can distill from that debate the key issues about what I think theoretical discourse is. And Sanford is just so amazing in his insights that I thought that was a very special comment. Now, there's something else I wanted to mention. I'm trying to think what that it is. Okay. I've lost it slightly. I just want to say that the two. Here we go. Yeah, the first lecture, the first session, we had problems because it transpired that you can't upload a video onto YouTube where you have excerpts of a TED talk. There's some copyright law there, so I'm going to have to rework some of that and get rid of some of the. There's a way around it. But that to my mind, that was my most important contribution, was the first one, and it'll be up there soon. All of these talks will be up there soon. So and some of them already are. So I would encourage you to have a look at that. I think there's some really amazing discussions that are happening. I think that personally for me, the AI and neuroscience one was very good. There's also a really good one right after this, because we pre-recorded it, about the future of education, the future of the university. Nadia Torani, Hashim Sarkis, Ela Berman, and Eva Franch. The sensitive issue, I don't know if you know the news, but Eva Franch has been kicked out of the AA, or there's a vote of no confidence, which is very difficult, partly because she's the first female director of the AA, and that's really unfortunate in many ways. I don't know the politics of the decision, but it's also difficult because we recorded the session when she was still the director of the AA, and by the time we played it 2 days later, it might be the case that she's no longer there. I don't know what's going on, but there is anyway a good discussion there. And there'll also be a fun one that later on, I say this evening, but maybe in your country it'll be later, it will be tomorrow, where Ciro Nachli, Ciro is one of the great people who, when I was teaching the AA, one of the really interesting people, very theoretical in his own way. He's got Sanford included in his discussion, and Jesse Reiser and Alejandro Zairopolo, I think Bob Zummel maybe as well. that's going to be an interesting discussion. There are a lot of discussions that are there, and most of them are really interesting. Last night there was one on borders I thought was great. Gabe, where he was. I think one of the points is kind of in terms of borders, what, you have to break down the border between architecture and other disciplines. When in 1995 or 6 or something, I organized this conference, the one that led to Architecture Revolution, and it was called Beyond the Wall. And the wall was both the wall in terms of it was about the collapse of the Iron Curtain, but also it was about the collapse of this wall around architecture and trying to kind of engage with some discipline with with thinkers from other areas. So anyway, today we're going to have to finish on time because I really want you guys to go and listen to Nadir Tirani and his team. I mean, it's a very sophisticated thinker. And I think just what I want to say, one thing, so I'm waffling on, but never mind. And that is that, to my mind, there was, as Sanford was talking about this yesterday, there is a kind of generation of architectural designers and thinkers who kind of were formed in the 90s by a lot of these ideas, and I think some of the ideas from outside architecture that made, people like, Rem Koolhaas and Bernard Tschumi, they had all read this stuff. Rem doesn't quote all these thinkers, but it's there in his thinking. And I think that my point would be, is part of the reason why a lot of these kind of designers were so significant or have been so significant is that they have taken on board this criticism and used it as productively in order to go and critique things. I think today that we're in a world where, I went to the Venice Biennale when Rem was curating it, and I was teaching the GSD at the time, and I was taken around by some GSD students, and there was so much work went into this thing. At every single room, there was a book written about every single room, I think, in the exhibition. And the point is, it was a completely glorious failure because nobody paid attention to all the content there. We live in a kind of soundbite culture, more like Bjarke Ingels than Rem Koolhaas, but I think it's important to keep alive that sort of critical discourse, and I think that's what makes, to my mind, people like Rem so interesting as architects, because behind all that work, behind their design work, they've got this very sophisticated understanding of criticism. Okay, we're now up to 65, and I don't know how many we got on the streaming thing, but maybe lots more. So let's get going. Marrikka, I've been looking forward to this. Sanford, I cannot see if he's here. Sanford, are you here yet? I think we'll have to start without Sanford.
He may have actually collapsed from exhaustion. Knowing Sanford, yeah. he kind of shoots his bolt and then he's done.
Yeah. I should say we don't have Antoine today. Just to remind people, Antoine is who was Marrikka's PhD supervisor, by the way.
Yeah.
He's examining a PhD student today. So anyway, I got a message. Okay.
Oh, hi, Sanford.
Oh, great, good. Let's get going. Fantastic.
Okay, I'm gonna go ahead, guys, and just get right into it. So I do want to make sure that we have time for discussion afterwards. But I did want to say before I start that AI and in general the question of machine intelligence is not a long-standing interest of mine. It's something that I started to grapple with when I came to SCI-Arc, which is the land of computation, particularly compared to the GSD, which seems very provincial sometimes in comparison. So my remarks are maybe more forming than formed. So let's share screen. Okay, so you guys can see that, yeah? Okay. So I'm actually starting today with a philosopher that Sanford introduced me to. And for those of you who are familiar with him, you'll see that in my title. I'm going to be talking about AI and related things in architecture through the lens of the 20th century French philosopher, Gilbert Simondon, who's best known for his theory of individuation, which was profoundly influential to people like Gilles Deleuze I think it's also been very influential for Bruno Latour, I should say. But he also wrote a little book, maybe his like minor thesis on technical objects. And I think even though it was written very long ago, I think it was published in French in 1951, I think it still has something to say to us today as we confront our new reality of many, many intelligences and many, many machines. So I'm actually going to start with, so this is a very helpful little foursquare. It's from a very classic book on AI. It was published in the mid-90s by Peter Norvig and Stuart Russell, called Artificial Intelligence, A Modern Approach. And I actually would encourage those of you who are interested in this subject to read that book, even though it's really old. I think they're going to come out with a new version that we've been expecting a new edition imminently. So that'll be exciting when that comes. But it's got a very beautiful kind of history of thinking and history of philosophy at the beginning of the book, which makes it worthy of reading even so long after its initial publication. And what they point out is that artificial intelligence can be categorized in the following way. So there are systems that think like us, and you can think here about, and Neil spoke about this through the lens of Blade Runner, the Turing test. You can think about systems that act like us and how one might examine systems that act like us, terrifying thought. And then there's a smaller subset, if you like, of systems that think rationally, and then an even smaller subset of systems that act rationally. And they start the book out in this way just to point out that when we talk about modern AI and we talk about the actual procedures that go, the computational procedures that go into creating, for instance, GANs or other types of intelligences or pseudo-intelligences that we work with, we are actually talking about that lower right quadrant. And I would say, actually, the reason this is important is because the idea that we would focus out of all of these things on systems that act rationally already represents a degree of modesty in our societal ambition toward artificial intelligence. And it already represents, I would say, a kind of value of expediency over discovery in our pursuits. And I think this may go some way toward explaining our corollary focus in the field of architecture on what AI can do for us, as opposed to what it might lead us to discover. And the reason I'm making this point is because Gilbert Simondon, in his work on the mode of existence of technical objects, right off the bat starts out with a kind of important basic philosophical point. And of course, this is not something that is new to his thought. It's been known in philosophy since the time of the ancients. But he points out that even our word technology, and certainly our contemporary attitude toward technology, it comes from ancient Greek thought. And it begins with a split between Techne, which is the work of slaves, and what is often called noble arts or noble thought, which is the work of the kind of free elite. And of course, we can still see the linguistic legacy of the kind of master-slave dichotomy built into our thinking of technology and technical fields, the linguistics, the terminology around technical fields, ranging from hydraulics and railway systems to computer programming and electronic communication. So a lot of kind of master-slave language. It's still there and still used. And Simondon recognized the diminishment of technology that attended the diminishment of enslaved persons. And he recognized that this diminishment had resulted in the false valuation of technology as fundamentally lesser than other forms of production, like the writing of philosophy or poetry or the crafting of paintings or sculptures. Now, this attitude is particularly troubling in architecture. This is some ancient Greek slaves for you working in a mine. But this attitude is particularly troubling in architecture, I would say, because architecture is an irreducible compound, almost like a colloidal mixture of techne and noble arts. And so as that kind of compound, I think it's quite interesting to us. And I'm going to go back to something that Neil said in his framing remarks, and has actually been a lifelong commitment of his to actually go outside the discipline for a second and look at it from a distance and from a critical lens. I think architecture occupies a very interesting and critical juncture in our larger construction of culture, because it very often both gives the lie to any clear dichotomy between techne and noble arts or noble thought, and often traces its consequences. So think, for instance, of, and I just wanted to go back to Alberti. We can't get away from Alberti, yeah? Right? I just wanted to repeat something that actually Neil had said, and of course this is his excellent translation from the Latin, right? Just listen to the split between techne and noble arts that's expressed here in Alberti's famous treatise on architecture. By the way, often translated to get the full effect of the Latin, right? On the art of building, on the art of building, the kind of the raising up to the status of elite culture of the mason who can speak Latin. The carpenter is but an instrument in the hands of the architect. The carpenter is but an instrument in the hands of the architect. And then a bit later, him I consider to be an architect who by sure and wonderful reason and method knows both how to devise through his own mind and energy and to realize by construction whatever can be most beautifully fitted out for the noble needs of man. The noble needs of man by the movement of weights and the joining and the massing of bodies. To do this, he must have an understanding and knowledge of all the highest and most noble disciplines. And don't think for a minute that those two nobles are stuck in there by accident. Yeah? Okay. Where was I? Oh yeah. And then think a little bit further, it was 100 years later in the Renaissance, of a figure like Palladio, who very famously established a kind of very strict dichotomy in his 4 books on architecture, which is based on brick construction as opposed to stereotomy. It's much easier to kind of establish a strict dichotomy between techne and the noble arts when you're dealing in brick, actually, than it is when you're dealing in heavy, large masses of stone. A very dualistic system of constructional labor versus architectural effect. So then what he does is he'll split up the kind of techne part of architecture in sections of his book, like the section on walls, which I'm showing you an image from here. That's oriented towards techne. And then he'll have a completely other kind of section on frames, even though the kind of proportional system of the one is of course dependent on the labor of the other and the material outworkings of the other. And here you can even see, I like this particular plate because it shows you the kind of the meticulous depiction of every little bit of constructional labor, every unit of constructional labor here depicted in these little tiny bricks, and then the kind of clear overlay of noble thought and noble art on top. I did want to point out the importance here of the brick, because the brick in philosophy, in ancient Greek philosophy up until the present day, has been connected to the same dichotomy of thinking. The brick is often used as a classic example of hylomorphism, which is the idea that you can impose an ideal form on matter, as though matter were an inert substance that can be shaped. And embedded within the notion of hylomorphism, which is something, of course, that Simondon and many subsequent philosophers have spoken out very strongly against, because they recognize the limits of the dualistic system of thought it implies, is also maybe a less discussed, or now we're just beginning to realize the full implications of this, the less discussed implications of a unit of construction that is tied to the manual labor of two hands working at the scale of the human, at the scale, let's say, of the degraded labor of the slave. Now, before we get into AI proper, I think we should just quickly examine perhaps one of the most cynical outworkings of this approach, and it comes directly from the Palladian tradition, and even before that, from maybe one of Palladio's references, the Plinian tradition, the Plinian letters that were rediscovered in the Renaissance with such great fanfare and clearly describe the kind of noble arts versus slave ideal. And this, of course, is Thomas Jefferson's Monticello in Virginia, where Palladian dualism is extended from the parged surfaces of brick portico columns. You can see here underneath the smoothness of the surface is the individual unit of the brick, deep into the domestic interior. Thomas Jefferson was very famously quite mechanically ingenious about the way he simultaneously enjoyed the labor of his slaves and suppressed the evidence of it to himself and to others. So here you have this kind of mechanical ingenuity of this wine elevator that appears in the side of a fireplace surround, so that you can get your connoisseurship without thinking about the slavery, or here the way that he invented this really quite ingenious and diabolical lazy Susan door, so that a slave could place hot dishes of food in these shelves, and then Jefferson could turn the door, revealing the food while concealing the slave with this door, quite a massive door with a central pin, secured with a central pin. So just to make this point clear, here the noble arts, evaluated in terms of aesthetics, mask over an integrated system of human machine labor that is conveniently evaluated according to quite separate criteria. Ultimately, this separation aims to partition what we recognize as beautiful from what we know to be good, as if the continuum between aesthetic and ethical judgment, and you guys have heard me yammering on about that previously, could be severed or suspended. And just to remind those I know many people in the audience are from other places and other cultures, and may not be fully aware of the brutal implications behind Jefferson's system. I like this really remarkable diagram of a slave ship and the logistics, the mechanical and just logistics involved in the enslavement of Africans coming to plantations like Jefferson's. And when I talk about the connection between aesthetics and ethics, there is actually, another useful Greek term, often translated as simply having to do with gentlemanly conduct, kolokagathia, which is literally a compound of beauty and right conduct, that speaks to maybe something that Kant expressed in its most thorough form in Western philosophy, in more recent Western philosophy, which is the same set of human faculties, the faculty in what he called the faculty of judgment, are involved in evaluating what's beautiful and what's right. And they're very difficult to separate out. In fact, one will eventually give way to the other, I would say. And there's I wanted to bring up the reference of Elaine Scarry here, because I think she's written quite well on that subject. She does not invoke that term. Yes. In this light, architecture's engagement with artificial intelligence is worthy of careful attention. Either we will reinforce and accelerate the divide between master, noble, beautiful, and slave, technological, useful, if I can just compound those terms for a second, thus also sustaining the inequities and exclusions this dichotomy creates, or we will invent different ontologies and epistemologies in collaboration with our machines. Thus far, I have to say, the trend is not particularly encouraging. There are two camps involved in architecture AI development, where those two things meet, broadly speaking. One is concerned with the production of strange images or weird images, which we are asked to evaluate aesthetically. And here I'm showing the work of one of my colleagues at SCI-Arc, with whom I have some profound intellectual disagreements, David Rue. This is somewhere in Acadia. This is from a fairly recent body of work that he and Carol Klein produced. And this is a much older piece that I believe was shown earlier in this series of lectures, Klex. So on the one hand, we've got the production of images that we're asked to evaluate aesthetically. And on the other, we've got the much more corporate concern with the automation of boring and intensive labor, which we are asked to evaluate pragmatically. And here is the Blocks AI platform developed by Gensler and used in a kind of strangely incestuous way to produce this particular building. This is the Dulles Living Well Institute in New York, which is not only built using a kind of very, very basic AI platform, but then also incorporates various aspects of AI into its interface with its human users. Now, in between these two poles lies the sluggish corporate behemoth of boring and intensive labor as the production of aesthetic value, which presents clients and other constituencies with bundles of pre-stylized design decisions, as if these were inevitable outcomes of an advanced computer-driven metabolization of outside forces. And while it is true that architecture has a long and fruitful history of repackaging the high cost of beauty as practical necessity, here the outcome is often a disappointing stocking of triangulated meshworks stretched over forms like fishnets over fat, somewhat slimming but only from a distance. Moreover, large corporate practices have a vested interest in turning new projects into known problems that require only minor increments of inventiveness. So here I'm showing you one of Patrick Schumacher's kind of most horrific projects, I have to say, with the triangulated meshwork involved in the computation of smoothed surfaces, literally manifest on the outside of the building as a kind of articulation for free, right? This is the most banal form of the expression of boring and intensive labor masquerading as aesthetic value, I would say. And you can see the way that they publish the kind of back of house computation as if computation of non-architectural issues like secondary steel structure were adequate for the justification of aesthetics. And when I think of the kind of the minor increments of inventiveness that are often justified using computer modeling and other sort of basic forms of AI, I think of projects like this. It's actually quite, it's got quite a beautiful aesthetic to it. This is the SOM courthouse in LA, where I normally am, where very, very minor increments of inventiveness are trumpeted as kind of major technological feats. And I would say the issue with this is that even their most triumphant contributions to the built environment, and this is not a bad SOM building, where they absorb much of the market share, an increasing amount of the market share, become therefore variants on the known. Like you can think of the nearby building that Rainer Banham so celebrated, the LA Water and Power building, as maybe a much more inventive building in this ilk of the decorated and glowing lantern box. And thus they have little, if any, power to challenge the imagination. Now, smoothing over all of these approaches, meanwhile, is a kind of Gaussian blur of imprecise terminology. So at the moment, we glibly describe scripting techniques, which are the very, very, very lowest form of automated and artificial intelligence. And by the way, scripting in architecture has been around since the paperless studio of the 90s. This is not a new thing, as if it were learning. So we describe scripting as if it were learning. We describe automation as if it were learning. Of course, this allows architects to reap two benefits at once, right? First of all, we have new enthusiasm for old tools we are already quite good at as a profession. And this is often, if not always, the case with weird 2D images. And then also we gain faster ways of running through plotting tasks where the outcomes are alternates to choose from, rather than feedback loops that have been initiated. And I want to just point out that the seemingly enormous gulf between artist architects who produce images of maniacal baroques, and by the way, it's not inconsequential that those weird images are very often rigorously symmetrical, by the way. And service architects who aim to find more efficient solutions faster is small compared to the gap between scripting or automation and the design of truly intelligent agents capable of learning and adapting. Yeah. Meanwhile, the same bifurcation that separated Jefferson's connoisseurship from his mechanical bricolage still stands and is even deepened. So contrast scripting, oh, here's the SOM building in its kind of horrifically minor context, yes. This is from their website. So contrast scripting, which is the execution of a known sequence of commands, actual artificial intelligence in the higher sense, in the learning sense, which is what we're aiming for, and we're not there yet, just to clarify and follow what Neil very properly said about this. There's like a feed forward is kind of getting there in some senses, but it's not, you know, we still have a long way to go. But I want to make sure that we don't confuse where we are with where we aim to be. Even in its narrowest lower right quadrant sense, to go back to my initial slide, involves learning, which is defined in technical terms as receiving percepts from the environment via sensors and performing actions in response through effectors. So the important thing to know there is that this is something that is deeply imbricated in the environment, and that environment is a hybrid environment or compound environment of what we might think of very casually as nature or other forms of out there-ness, and technology and human culture. All of those things are involved in that term environment here in the technical sense. And then the idea that percepts or cues would be gleaned from the environment via sensors, and then that actions would be performed in response through effectors, which are just the kind of the way the work is done, is actually identical to the way humans learn and operate in the world. That's the intelligence part of the artifice. Now, what this allows, or the hope, is that this will allow known procedures, even with wildly unknown outcomes, to give way to circuits between percepts and actions that build an increasing potential to veer from human experience and expectations. This is a wondrous and vital thing. I want to return to Simondon here, who speaks of the necessity of letting technical objects develop themselves. And one of the most surprising things in the middle of the, like this guy is talking about cars, basically. He's talking about cars and other, what we would think of as rudimentary forms of technology compared to AI, but his intuitions are really beautiful. and as I said, I think still very apt. He's very clear about the opposition between something as a technical system or technical ensemble that is open and flexible versus one that is automated. Whoops. I'm gonna have to go to a quieter spot in my spa. Hold on. Okay, sorry. Let me know, is that still too loud?
That's okay, that's okay.
Okay, it'll just be like a nice soothing backdrop. Where was I? Oh yeah, okay. Yes, so the difference between an open and flexible system and one that is automated is really essential for Simondon. And he associates automation with slavery, actually. And with the kind of tendency that we might have to turn our kind of most wondrous technical objects into these narrow, repetitive, purely profit-driven pieces of kind of rote labor. And for him, the loss there is that you lose the potential for these things that have a kind of embodied intelligence, to go back to what Antoine was saying, an embodied intelligence to develop sort of on their own terms and with their own potentials, which would be other than the ones that we immediately try to instrumentalize them for. So just to kind of walk through a couple basic features of this. When he talks about open and flexible systems, he's talking about those that are capable of adapting to their milieus. And when he's talking about automated systems, he's talking about those that are closed and static. Again, as I said earlier, a milieu, it's important to understand, is a compound of environmental and technical context. Now, when you have an open and flexible technical object, he calls that kind of you never get a completely concrete technical object, but you can get close, he thinks. And I would think that someday in the future, when we achieve more sophisticated versions of learning enabled artificial intelligence than we have now, we will be quite close to what he calls a concrete technical object. Concrete technical objects being those, as I have on the screen, that are able to interact directly and non-symmetrically with their associated milieu. So the aim here is a mutual and compatible relationship that is built on that same kind of dialogue, that same kind of conversation that was raised earlier. And I really appreciate Neil's point here, that computation literally means thinking together. Now, two subpoints to make here while I have this on the screen. One is that Simondon recognized that the enslaving tendencies that, say, profit-driven or power-driven forces ranging from the corporation to the state exhibit without fail when it comes to technology. The intense push towards automation, keeps company with, and indeed is in many ways exactly like and exactly part of the same enslaving attitude toward nature, up to and including what Norbert Wiener once called the human use of human beings. And the turning of the infinite and fragile abundance of the world, as Sanford keeps reminding us, our one world into a kind of static reserve. There's my one Heideggerian ism that I couldn't get rid of. In other words, Simondon, and here I think his philosophy, again, remains very fresh and very relevant, despite the fact that you have to slog through all that stuff on cars to get there, challenges the pop Heideggerian opposition between technology and nature, as if technology were somehow at fault rather than also subjugated, and as if machine intelligence were somehow malign, as opposed to the supposed goodness of natural intelligence. And then the second point I wanted to make here follows from the first, which is that distributed agency, not only but certainly including distributed intelligence, has to be accorded across the continuum of things. And this is quite clear in Simondon's larger body of work, and of course in the work that followed from Simondon, and I'm here thinking of Deleuze specifically. Right, from silicats to silicon to data server centers, and again to artificial intelligence. And I use the specific example of silicates and their relation to silicon here on purpose, because Ruskin has been often invoked over the last several days. Ruskin, who very famously afforded agency to materials and to workmen, and who understood the deep connection between ecology and design. And I'm showing you some of his very beautiful drawings as I say this. I will also point out that Ruskin denied the notion of free will almost entirely, and ultimately I believe he erred in a way that Simondon is scrupulous to avoid. Ruskin made literal connections rather than analogous ones, up to and including the equation of life with non-life, and the crediting to a kind of God-nature hybrid of inescapable and never-changing laws. Be that as it may, Ruskin did have a lot to say about the self-organizing processes and potentials of silicates in particular, where the building blocks of computation. He called it the spiraling force of silicates that perhaps deserves to be revisited today. And here is one of his drawings of a brick, which is decidedly not hylomorphic. So I wanted to say that automation and automatism, to the extent that we achieve or ascribe them, are perhaps the most impoverished and the least interesting approaches to both technical and natural objects, the most easily co-opted by existing regimes of power and wealth, and the least likely to be granted the status of, let's say, friendlies or familiars, enchanting entities with whom we can both work and play in various states and to various degrees of affiliation and affordance. And here is where, again, the great connection that Neil made between what Antoine was talking about when he talked about a conversation and the very notion of thinking together is so germane. Now, the reason I think this kind of thinking together, assuming it includes what Antoine is careful to call embodied thinking, which includes discovery and play and other forms of action within the sensorium, as vital and wondrous, is because human thought in the crushing context, and this is something actually that Victoria was talking about yesterday, I believe, in the truly crushing context of ever more automated and fine-grained regimes of power, is often routine and narrow, following well-worn grooves without much overview. I'd say that within architecture, and indeed within all creative aspects of our culture, our ambitions in the world today suffer from the smallness of our desires and the limits of our imaginations. Additional forces for intellection and discovery and creativity, particularly those capable of producing what seem to us to be slack moves, would be welcome allies in our great struggle to create what Sanford refers to as an affordance landscape, an abundance of doorknobs, or what Deleuze calls unbound points, or I suppose any kind of eruption or bumpiness that presents an opportunity for engagement. To this end, architects should engage machine intelligence directly and horizontally by forming partnerships rather than instituting command structures. We have already demonstrated an uncanny ability to build unwanted biases into our agents. So witness technologies from color film calibrated to best capture Shirley's, which are the, of course, the 1950s versions of Karen's, to soap dispensers that struggle to see dark hands. It strikes me as equally likely that we could learn an ethic of radical equality and inclusion alongside of our machines and collaborate with them in the production of a new aesthetic paradigm or new aesthetic paradigms and new ways of making in the world that might never occur to human intelligence alone. The goal would be akin to what Simondon calls techno-aesthetics, which is, I think, a truly dreadful term, nevertheless, in which the link between aesthetics and ethics is acknowledged and strengthened. And by the way, if you doubt the link between aesthetics and ethics, you might consider how often racism is a truly aesthetic problem, yeah? Something that is triggered by the way someone else appears, or something else appears, even from a distance or at a glance, before cognition even sets in, and is often accompanied by an almost automatic, and I use that term advisedly, triggering of deadly violence. Part of the task will be to acknowledge that the widespread fear of artificial intelligence as a devourer of livelihoods and creativity and even free will is in fact a widespread and well-founded fear of other humans. To return to the condition between technology and slavery, the human use of human beings up into and including their ultimate disposability seems a common trait of our species. Yet, perhaps our lack of attentiveness to our tools has led to some questionable assumptions about both of our respective functions. And here I'd just like to end with the work of Casey Ream, which is the thing about talking about Casey's work is that you're talking about a long process that is only just initiated. And so you end up talking about little fragments of possibility, maybe like the fragments that people used to talk about in the Romantic period, right? Sort of incomplete, but also whole in themselves, rather than something that feels complete or compelling. Because as I said, the exciting thing, but also the challenging thing about AI is that we are not there yet. Casey has actually shown a pretty serious commitment to move beyond earlier works like this one, which are very much in the mode of the production of weird images, although I appreciate that he is rigorous in his avoidance of symmetry, to things that actually involve more active forms of machine learning. So here's where the kind of transition for him was made between sort of neural net processing, convolutional neural network processing, distorting and kind of mesmeric and surprising ways Baroque paintings of flowers, to actually more sophisticated process of convolutional neural networks that were able to kind of sweep the latent landscapes of the desert and find possible urbanisms hidden within the data sets thus revealed. Here's another version of the same kind of work applied to the vertical surfaces of cities. And then this has led him into some kind of weird, and right now, I don't know if it's because I'm human and my aesthetics are formed based on what humans like, but I find these works deeply ugly, like incredibly ugly. And I actually think that there may be something to that ugliness, actually, that is worth considering and worth trying to evaluate via different means. Where he's producing projects like this, which is literally sweeping various kinds of intelligence together. So the intelligence of the mid-century modern homes that are often found in the California desert, and the kind of patterns and similarities that emerge over thousands and thousands of their plans. Then the kind of nuances or bumps or possibilities inherent in the desert landscape itself and what it suggests to machine vision. And then also even up into including the natural and lively propensities in the materials that he's using. Look at how ugly this is. I mean, it's ugly, 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 ugly. The material that he's using, which is a kind of a laminated composite wood grain panel, cross-laminated timber panel, sorry. So there are a number of different intelligences that are coming to play here beyond Casey's own. And Casey is actually, I think as you can see in his earlier work, quite sophisticated aesthetically. I mean, this is a really gorgeous animation that I'm showing you still from. But he's sort of letting these other things in, and then the process right now feels very weird and ugly. So you've got the house plans, which are, let's say, intelligence from the discipline. You've got the LiDAR scans of the desert, which are sort of machine vision crossed with the intelligence, let's say, or the organizational features of the planet. Together with some pretty interesting solar exercises. And then, of course, the intelligence of the material itself, an update to Louis Kahn's sort of horrible and hackneyed asking a brick what it wants to do, what it wants to be, here from Casey Ream. And then, of course, Casey's Casey's also embarked on a longer research project, which of course can only happen in the context of the academy and with continual infusions of cash from non-corporate sources, obviously corporate in the long run, but not corporate in the short run, where he aims to produce, quote, unanalyzable, end quote, architectural drawings like plans, in which boundaries are eschewed in favor of aggregates or densities of material that form via simultaneous bottom-up and top-down decisions. So this is not the machines will tell me how, and it's also not I tell the machines how, but rather bringing a range of intelligences to bear on an agonistic plurality of agents. So what I like about this very ugly work is that it does not reduce us to the automaticism of superorganisms like ants, and it also does not leave us to the paucity of our own knowledge and thought processes. In other words, it establishes a kind of broader plane of action with multiple zones of eruption. Approached from this angle, artificial intelligences swell the ranks of agents capable of producing compounds of the ethical and the aesthetic, and in ways that may very well be less predictable and consumable, less liable to co-option by hegemonic power than works produced by humans alone. And at the same time, designers engaged in work alongside machine intelligence would find their creative agency amplified, I would say, rather than harmed, not merely or even meaningfully due to any increase in efficiency, as if efficiency were a good in and of itself, but because the treacherous model of the solitary designer would perforce give way to a more accurate sense of an inexhaustible, multifaceted surplus of prospects and ideas. Given the multivalence and interconnection, or to use Sanford's term, interpenetration and depth of the problems that we face today, ranging from viral and bacterial onslaughts to systemic racial oppression, to the violent cognitive dissonance between the future as we wish it to be and the one confronting us. Such imaginative access is crucial. Thank you.
Great. Do you want to unshare your screen?
I do.
That's. I don't know. Can I just say something first? I'm more interested to hear what Sanford says than what I've got to say. But just one small comment. I mean, well, maybe two. First, actually, the art of building, that was a mistranslation. I mean, you know, talking about master-slave relationship, okay, I was the person who did the translation. I'm not even on the contract, actually. It's kind of interesting. I was just a humble student working for Joseph at the time. But I did it, okay? And in Latin, it's de re edificatoria. Now, that means business, as in res publica, but on the matter of building, which is kind of weird because that was precisely the problem that the guys from FAT pointed out. It's become too much of a business now, but that is the term. I should also say that Joseph insisted, and I couldn't say anything because I was just a student at the time, on adding the words in 10 books, which are not in the Latin. De re edificatoria has no reference to 10 books. So I had this discussion with Peter Eisenman, who's working on the theme of congenitas, which is the one word that was so complicated we didn't, well, it was one or two words, that we didn't translate it. And I had to point out to him that we actually translated a word that wasn't even there. The words in 10 books are not there. Anyway, that's one thing. Just, I want to say one thing just quickly about the question. First of all, I never quite got the technology distinction, and I share a common background with Moise and Mustafavi and a few other more conservative thinkers like Perez Gomez, David Leatherbarrow, because they were all taught by Joseph and Dalibor Vesely, as indeed I was. So, but I don't think I'm so conservative, okay? But we had a discussion about Techne, and I never quite got the distinction. I don't get the distinction between architecture and building. To my mind, it's all building, just maybe a good or a bad building. But the key question I wanted to bring in here, I always disagree with Mark Cousins about Kant, or at least he disagreed with my book, Aesthetics of Architecture, because he's a kind of Kantian. And the point about aesthetics is it really offers a critique of Kant, the idea of disinterested beauty. It's, to my mind, a real problem. And Derrida, first of all, addressed it in Truth in Painting. Like, you know, we have to think about what has been outside the frame, what has been left out. And that you could take that as one way of thinking about Monticello. I mean, art, it doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's a part of an industry, right, of the art world. But my chief concern is the problem of aestheticization, the problem of judging things simply in terms of beauty and overlooking other concerns. On the one hand, I watched a review with Mark Foster Gage from some students, and I was there with Aki Menges, and it was designed for a bridge. And he said to us, I just wanted you to judge it in terms of its beauty. And Akim and I looked at each other and think, how could you just judge a bridge in terms of its beauty without thinking about its performance? But I think the more to the point is aestheticization really leaves out, aesthetics really leaves out, this is the point of the whole point about the book Aesthetics. You anesthetize architecture by aestheticizing it. If you see it just in terms of beauty, I often give the example of, let's say, as live on the beach here in Venice, if there was an explosion out to sea, maybe it's the French testing out a nuclear weapon, and you were to say, oh, that's a beautiful mushroom cloud, and isn't it so beautiful and pink? You're missing out the fact that all the social, political, and economic content that is there. And I think that is very, very dangerous. I have a chapter in Aesthetics of Architecture that didn't endear me to Michael Sorkin, where I said the architect is fascist. You know, and what I was pointing out is you see these architects sort of talking about urban planning and talking about cutting a route through a street. It's very similar to how Hitler would look at models of Berlin, and you aestheticize things. You could cut a street through the city, and it maybe looks beautiful, but what happens to the people who are displaced in that moment? So the point is that you rinse something out of the social, political, economic content when you look at that. Now, so my point.
Just remind me of your own background here. Did you practice or study architecture?
Yes, I am a registered architect in the UK. I took my part 3. Yeah. So Anyway, so
I think it's quite a, it's I mean I broadly agree with you. I remember Aesthetics of Architecture. I read it, but I also think that it's quite difficult for anybody. You know, this is where there's maybe a little bit of a loss when many voices are coming to bear on architecture from the outside, and fewer voices are coming to bear on architecture from the inside. I think it's we have to have both. We have to have both. I dispute Sanford's claim to be an outsider. I think he's quite an insider at this point, in a very productive way. But I think it's important actually to say, for those of us who have a background in architecture and who are engaged in architectural practice, that any attempt to judge something solely by its beauty becomes almost immediately absurd if beauty is considered in isolation from the way something is made or the implications that it has. Now, that's not to say that I subscribe to an overdetermined theory that architecture is the product of other forces. I don't. But I think it's precisely trying to break down that dichotomy between master and slave that is one of the essential tasks of theory today. And actually to go beyond that, probably the great tasks of theory in front of us, and I'm sorry to say that there seem to be so few of us standing at this moment in time, if I can be so bold as to include myself in your number, it is that task of reintegration. That task of reintegration as it has to do with the environment and also with issues of equity and inclusion. That somehow, when you, I mean, come on, you guys, I'm assuming you guys occasionally venture onto Archinect or these other forums, or perhaps, I don't know, Neil, if you're a registered architect, you might have the misfortune to receive the official organ of the AIA in your mailbox every month. I know I do, which is now at the moment Architect, and I have never seen such ugly drivel in my life. So the consequence goes both ways. It's not only that you have Mark Foster Gage claiming that you can evaluate a bridge made of glitter and angel's wings purely in aesthetic terms, but also that we have lost the ability to think aesthetically about the great problems of our time, which is truly unfortunate.
Yeah, no, I'm actually I'm registered in the UK, so I'm ARB, RIBA, that kind of stuff. So not AIA.
Well, there's a lot of RIBA is also pretty good at producing that kind of slurry.
Yeah, well, that's another question. But so I want to pick up on one thing, which I thought was kind of interesting when you said about Hitler and aesthetics. I mean, so my point I was making on aesthetics, very controversially, within every architect, within every fascist, there's a would-be architect, because all these guys, Ceausescu and Hitler and Stalin, were trying to remodel cities. And I make this comment that within every architect, there's a would-be fascist, which is kind of a very provocative comment, but it's kind of interesting. What I want to do is just going to take the kind of question about Hitler, because maybe you could see part of the problem of Hitler was that he was over-aestheticized, in the sense that he was, of course, trained as an artist, and he had a very, very clear sense of developing an aesthetic, in the sense that he had Albert Speer, choreographed these sublime aesthetic spectacles, the kind of cathedral of lights, and they were really highly aesthetic things, and to the point that the outfits of the SS were designed by Hugo Boss. I mean, it was, and Leni Riefenstahl was filming these things. The whole thing, in some sense, was an aesthetic project, and maybe that was the part of the problem. I just want to float that out there, because I think it's a really kind of a interesting kind of question you raised or touched upon and it's not just to do with the kind of the blonde Aryan thing. It's actually, maybe it goes deeper than that. And I'll leave it at that, because one thing Antoine taught me was to keep my comments short, and I want to make room for Sanford. And I'm sure Sanford has something interesting to say.
Hi there, guys. Yes, you know what? My fucking doorbell's ringing. Give me a second. I'll be back.
Yeah. Okay. But just while we I wanted to say something else, Marrikka.
But I also want to make sure that we have time to involve our very patient and probably totally exhausted audience.
Okay, sure. Well, let me just, while Sanford's sorting his doorbell out, I think also interactivity is something I think absolutely crucial, and I want to say that AI should be part of that whole thing. I'm I'm co-editing a book on interactive futures at the moment. The whole logic of camouflage was about adaptation and so on. And I think that within AI, there is that capacity to really have an interactive system. And in my new book, I talk about how as a chapter called The Brain City, how the city could use AI to be interactive in the way that the brain is a kind of in a state of dynamic equilibrium. But I just want to say also that there's just a brief comment, the kind of SOM, whatever AI was used there, that was so primitive to what is used now. And it's like, you know, the term AI was used from like 52 or something onwards. Actually, it's like comparing a kind of the first ever car to a Tesla. You know, what's happening now is just a different league, and you can't even compare it. It really, it's just beyond that. And I listed out the factors that know what's allowed that to happen, but really, there is no comparison. The term is used, but there is no real comparison to be made. Can I just ask, just quickly, while we're waiting for Sanford to get back, whether Chow, are there any questions that have been put onto either Bilibili or YouTube? Because I really want to try and get Marrikka and Sanford to respond in some way. Chow? I just want, for our Chinese listeners, I want to say one thing. First of all, Alberti came out in Chinese, but Rethinking Architecture is going to come out in Chinese, hopefully fairly soon. And what I really like about what's happening in China now, there is a development of a kind of theoretical discourse, and maybe Chow is at the forefront because Chow just finished his PhD on Andy Clark. And you know, I think that in China right now, where people have, the debate has moved forward so quickly. I'm looking forward to the moment when we actually have a real theoretical discourse there. Sanford, sorry, you're back from your doorbell.
Shit, I missed what you said because I couldn't hear quite well from where I was. I heard the name Andy Clark come up a couple of times. Let me just go back to a couple of things, and we'll warm up and we'll get back to exactly what it is that you might have said. I got a feeling that it does connect us in a richer way to the problems that got laid down. I just want to say a couple of things for the record. This is our last day. This is our last hour. And in a way, we got a whole fresh kind of feeling here that Marrikka brought in, which we should capitalize on actually as much as possible. As if in a weird way, as if we had finally done our laundry and folded it all, and we were actually ready after dredging up so much of the past. And the useful and creative, shall we say, inheritances or residues from the past that, say, people from our generation or from the contexts in which we were formed, in which they really are critical aspects of the endowment that needs to be present when thinking through important problems. And there, I would just like to reconfirm or reaffirm rather that AI, whether that is the name of an important problem today or whether it is a symptom of an incredibly important problem today, doesn't matter. It's important. And it needs not only to be addressed, but we need to create a kind of a culture in which it is understood that that problem is a central, shall we say, ethical and political, but also perhaps aesthetic and et cetera, et cetera. I can add a couple more, obviously as many more words to that as possible. Get back to what Marrikka's talk is all about. First of all, I thought it was a beautiful, beautiful talk. And what is also beautiful about it is the way in which it could be seen as the preparation of a landscape, or maybe when you prepare a site that you're going to build on, but you don't yet know what you're going to build, but you still decided that you would apply, shall we say, design intelligence, or shall we say, a rich investment of let's say, incipient morphogenetic energy and understanding to the site, if you like. That's to say, in which you begin to invest the site with biases that you are very willing and committed politically and ethically to incorporate into the ultimate structure that gets built on it. For that, I found it to be both beautiful and illuminating for all the rest of us. That said, Marrikka, along with my collaborator now, Gökhan Kodolak, are continuing to think through ways, if you like, in which to use the example of Simondon in order to reactivate a whole set, shall we say, of understandings, but how we can change even perception in ways that we could create a context for far more rich engagement of architecture, which no longer, shall we say, gets hampered by inherited and uninteresting and unuseful cliches about the separations, if you like, of those domains which create us, such as Techne and whatever else it might be on the other side, culture, nature, et cetera, et cetera. Now, whether Simondon's reflections on technology are themselves adequate for that, I just want to say, I think there's probably, I don't personally, and this is personal, I don't personally think so. I don't think he's all that sophisticated, frankly, when it comes to thinking about technology, though certainly those ideas that Marrikka presented to us, such as the inheritance that comes from the master-slave paradigm, if you like, or matrix, inherited from the Greeks, such as the way and the directions, such as, let's say, the construction of how information flows, distribute, I hate this word. I spend a good decade trying to avoid the use of the word and even, shall we say, censoring its use, but I'm going to have to use it today. How it distributes, and it's really painful for me to use this word, how it distributes agency through, shall we say, the domain of concern. How, that's to say, the domain of concern is how and where we live. Okay, so the point really is this, is that my wish to sort of just include one extra viewpoint in the first part of what Simondon's thinking about Techne, which was way, way, way back in the 1950s. And as Marrikka intimated, in some way, even just by association, it kind of has a lot to do also with the spirit of the first waves of stylized modernism that, you know, the French context, the French 50s, late 40s and 50s context, design context is a fascinating thing to put into relation with Simondon's very early work here, which I believe, Marrikka can remind us, I believe was early 50s. And I think of things like Prouvé and others working in that particular way. The reason I want to mention that is simply this, is that at the time, Simondon's plea to bring Techne from below us into the realm, shall we say, of esteem, which that should, he could say, be shared by other forms of high culture. His belief that his efforts were required to bring Techne from the low arts to the higher arts, I think has absolutely changed. We live in an absolutely unabashed hypothesis and overestimation of the technological, where it has already come in many cases in prestige and almost everything else, especially in architecture, that it has overcome, shall we say, the other discourses and even the prestige of other forms of practice and knowledge. That said, I wanted to remind some, without actually naming names or even doing my very poor attempt to isolate specific instances. It just seems to me, and some of you may recognize this and some of you may dispute it, but based on my experience, I'm aware of a new movement in architecture, a kind of a discursive, what would the word, or a kind of a, there is, let's just say there is a, I can't find quite the words right now, but there is a kind of recognizable discourse emerging in which the word aesthetics, in a kind of a cult way, has become an almost standalone self-justification for thought and exploration and experiment in architecture, as if the discovery of an aesthetic or of a new aesthetic was in somehow a legitimate response to contemporary urgencies. I'm not going to shut the door on it, but I am going to say it doesn't sound very intelligent or very reasonable or even very responsible to me. Oh, I do note, though, that if it gets said enough, it starts to sound true. And I fear that it's starting to sound to a lot of people as true. I wanted to throw another thing at you, because Marrikka kept going on about ugly, 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 and I fucking do the same. But at the same time, I thought to myself, wow, interesting what Marrikka is presenting here as ugly. And I wondered whether or not she recognizes or has anything to say about the fact that, at least from the seats that I sit in a lot these days, ugly seems to be the new beautiful. And I just wonder what Marrikka's thoughts are on that, because frankly, I think she's quite close to that, I feel like she's probably experiences, I think she's, what I mean by close to it, I don't mean in her thought, I mean she's quite close to it in her everyday experience. Well, again, I want to ask Marrikka to give some thought now as she steps back into her own boots and maybe out of the temporary occupation of Simondon's boots, whether or not she also believes, as it seems Simondon started to say in a way, that Techne can develop on its own, or that there's even a modality in which we can understand Techne as separate from the, shall we say, the almost the invisible hand kind of organization of the expression, even if it's a false expression, of human need or of instrumentalization. I wonder whether we can separate Techne from instrumentalist thought, and especially from one-dimensional instrumentalist thought. And I wonder how we really, I mean, I'm asking Marrikka to answer from her boots, not from Simondon's boots, though I'd be interested to know how she understands what the world looks like from Simondon's position. But I'm just wondering whether or not the attempt to ennoble today, to ennoble Techne with supra-instrumentalist capacities, in that sense also perhaps with salvific or even messianic hope, is a complicated thing. Now, I know there are thinkers such as Timothy Morton, whose scrupulelessness and opportunistic half understandings are so likely to be able to grasp onto anything that sounds, that has the kind of hysterical sound of what I just proposed, and which would be very happy to immediately grab attention by associating those forms of aesthetic kind of well, I can only say hysterical kind of association, all based on syllogism and false thinking. I would say that to what degree ought this emerging thought paradigm, in what senses should it not continually re-invoke, if you like, the need to remain, shall we say, vigilant and not drop, shall we say, philosophical rigor or analytical rigor, simply in order to invite what seems like the aesthetic needs of the designer. So I hope in that, Marrikka, you'll hear some things that interest you to respond to. That's it.
I'm just going to respond briefly because I want to be fair to in the remaining time that we have. There's already 4 people who said that they have questions or thoughts.
All right, today we got to let that audience in.
Yeah, but I will make one point, which it's where I agree with Simondon, and that is, and by the way, let's not forget that the term flat ontology comes from Manuel de Landa here, and I don't want to throw that concept out like the baby with the bathwater in the proverbial sense, because I think that what Simondon is proposing is a kind of flat ontology between what we would think of as being the noble arts and noble thought on one side and Techne on the other. He's not proposing an ennoblement of Techne. That would actually be much closer to the Renaissance position and to the position of architecture kind of over the ages. So kind of flattening out and placing those things side by side is, I think, more accurate than a kind of elevation of Techne in the way that we see today, which, as you said, is often very unthinking, as though machines will save us. Right? I guess my point is that the machines are not going to destroy us, and the machines aren't going to save us. They're among us, and we have to figure out how to live with them. Maybe not too dissimilarly from the way that we have to figure out how to live with viruses. So I guess I'll leave it at that. I understand what you're saying, and I agree with much of it.
But what I really want you to do is speculate from your perspective on where the aesthetic might belong, or whether it's even worthwhile to discuss aesthetics at this very moment.
Yeah, I think it's utterly essential that we discuss aesthetics, because if we don't discuss aesthetics, they're just going to be discussed by others, and they're going to be invented by others. And I want architecture to have a stake in the future of the world. And part of that stake is going to be aesthetic. I don't want to, again, I'm against the kind of cleaving of those two. And I think, part of the problem is here that in academia, we have 2 casually elevated projects that have no way of landing in the world. And I like Mark Foster Gage, but I would place his work right in there. There's no way for that stuff to land in the world, and therefore it has limited value. But on the other hand, I also think Casey has a lot of aesthetic work in front of him to again make his work land in the world the other way, because you got to get that stuff paid for somehow. And you also have to figure out how to bring the voice of the human designer into the discussion in an honest way, not via a series of kind of sleights of hand and subterfuges that pretend that something is inevitable when in fact is entirely not. A lot of what architects do relative to AI right now is a combination of let's pretend as if it were so. So, and again, that's not necessarily a bad thing. Architects are great at playing let's pretend. But the fact of the matter is that unless there's real progress that's made in undoing that old dichotomy between Techne and aesthetics, or between Techne and noble thought, then it's not as though that's not going to happen. It's just going to happen in other domains. I'd like to go to some questions now.
Yeah, there are some questions here. I want to quickly say that there was a comment here by Ralph Spencer Steenblick, where he says, while I was studying at SCI-Arc, there were those who declared that aesthetics was the only way that architecture contributed to society. It's a very, I can understand that. Okay, that's typical of SCI-Arc. But anyway, let's have some questions from those with their hands up. I've got a bunch from this is going to be too much actually, but I've got a bunch coming in from WeChat via Chow. Also, if anybody on WeChat who knows my thing, please send a question to me. Let's see how we've got from questions. Does anyone have their hand up?
Yeah, so we've got, I'm gonna unmute Prava.
Yeah.
I think I'm unmuting you. Oh no, I'm not unmuting you. I can't unmute you. Prava, can you unmute yourself?
He's unmuted. Okay.
Okay. Go for it. Where are you?
He's in India, I think.
Oh, I can't hear you, Prava.
We can't hear. Maybe while we're waiting, we should go to Soumya, who's I think also in India. We can't hear Prava. Let me just try unmuting Soumya. Can't. Okay, Soumya.
Hi.
Hello.
First of all, I just wanted to say that today's presentation was absolutely incredible and so thought-provoking. So thank you for that, truly.
Thank you.
I watched the interview with Peter Eiselman and Nikolai Urusov a couple of days ago. And one of the points that they raised was that social and political issues are often neglected by architects these days. And I feel like that resonates with me because in the context of India, these problems, in my opinion, are highlighted. For example, casteism, which we like to think as a thing of the past, I still see shades of that happening. It's condemned by law and it's looked down upon in society in general. But I think that we as architects somehow unconsciously contribute to that thinking. And for example, last year for semester 7 in our architectural design studio, we had a housing project, and it was a high-rise building that we had to design, and we gave a separate service elevator and a separate residence elevator, which is a common practice. That was the norm, and that's a common practice that happens in high-rise buildings here. Or even a photo from a building by Rahul Mehrotra that Professor Picon showed a few days ago about where on one side there was this sort of green wall and then a glass and then a seating area on the other. And on one side we had a certain people belonging to a certain class sitting and using the building. And on the other side of the glass there were people from an economically backward class that were cleaning the glass on the other side. And so I think my question is, are we progressing in the wrong direction? And I just want to clarify that I'm not against technological advancement. I'm 22 years old. I have no reason to be. But I think I just want to know that, do you think that there is a way that we could possibly integrate the two, but that is technology and these social and political problems that exist in society today? And I'm hoping that there's a positive answer, because I wouldn't like to think that it's an either or situation.
Well, thank you for your question. I think you're right that it is problematic, but at the same time, it's maybe a two-part answer, which is basically to say that this is the problem that we face today, and I'm always very heartened to see thoughtful young people like yourself kind of saying, this is the problem I'm going to lay in front of me, because it surely is one of the great problems confronting us today. But it's also not, in some degrees, there's a difference between what architecture can do and what architecture can point to sometimes. And we're going to have to reformulate that as well. So it used to be the case, and you can see this in Rahul Mehrotra's work, for instance, it used to be the case that it was seen as being sufficient to point things out, right? With the understanding that architecture can't directly intervene into the caste system, but maybe it can make things more apparent and thereby increase awareness. And that was considered sufficient for a long time. I think one of the interesting things that technology puts on the table is a vast expansion of what we might think of as design in terms of landscapes, design in terms of ecologies, etc. And to that end, that old answer to an even older problem may no longer be the only one we have. But I can't be more specific than that because I haven't seen it. I keep looking for it. I keep opening up the sources that I have for new architecture. And what I see is an incredible divide between people producing digital slush, let's call it, digital slush on one side that sometimes is beautiful and sometimes is horrifically ugly. And people on the other hand that are trying to do socially responsible work, which seems to be the labor of the least talented among us for whatever reason. And I think that breaking that down is one of the great tasks confronting us today, and it's one that I'm glad to hear you're taking on.
Can I just throw out? We have so little time, but I want to throw some of the questions out that have appeared on the channel. We can or the comment thing just so people can reflect on them. First one is, would AI need to understand architecture in order to copy it? Then there's a related one, which is actually very similar. Would AI need to be conscious in order to create architecture? Would it be necessary that it understands the input parameters? Will it be necessary that it can identify them? Super, those are really good questions, but maybe we'll get a chance to address them. Similar way. The next one, how can we move architectural the discipline of architecture and bridge academia and practice around science and technology? Looking outside of the architectural discipline is needed. How would you propose that be done? In brackets, moving the entire discipline forward will require a reimagining of the architectural academic system. Completely agree. How has the architectural discipline not embraced the scientific research community to move the discipline forward? What are the barriers that can be turned to assets? Finally, there's another one coming down here. Yeah, sorry, there's another one here. Sorry. Am I the only one who finds the device of analogizing human slavery with the technological employment of novel devices deeply problematic? Hello? Sorry to smoke. Can I just kind of finish one more? Finally, there's another question here. The sciences could help us with our human desire aesthetics. Why can't the architectural discipline find a new vocabulary or conceptual framework to lead? Please cite philosophers, theorists. Marrikka, if the architectural discourse is not challenging the fundamental definitions of the field, what new publications and theories need to be made now? So that's just, I want to put those out there as we hardly get a chance to address all these questions, but at least they—
Can we know the names? Can we know the names of who asked those things?
No, I haven't got the names.
Okay. Can I ask Soumya, where did you go to school?
I'm still in school. I'm going to start my 5th year in August in New Delhi, India.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Thank
you. Can we just try Prava again, see if we can get his...
Hi, Neil. Am I audible now?
Okay, yes.
Oh, great. Perfect. So let me risk a bit in terms of my inquiry today, as it's the last day, and I'm glad. Well, my question is about this notion of disruption. And I want to look at it in terms of, rather than disruption, but rather than a sense or a natural proclivity or an urge to disrupt, as we humans have. So do you think that artificial intelligence with its, discretized or quantized disposition, would you think that it can lead to something like the way I would deliberately like to invoke Stravinsky for that matter, and I would like to also, invoke the genre jazz, that, they work towards a sense that, brought in a certain atonality, as Professor Sanford mentions in one of his papers. And I would really ask that, would artificial intelligence with its strict procedural, taught intelligence, would it ever be imparted the urge to disrupt and to work towards an atonal framework in the context of aesthetic and ethical enrichment?
My quick view on that is probably not. I mean, Sanford mentioned the word agency. one of the problems I have is Bruno Latour, and a lot of people talk about agency. I don't necessarily think AI has agency as yet until it has that kind of conscious capacity to really reflect on things. So that'd be my quick response.
So I guess I would say that I expect it probably will. I don't think it does yet. I think it probably will. And I think that's quite a good thing to aim for in the Simondonian sense. The other thing is that I think sometimes it already accomplishes that sort of in the messy interfaces between humans, various kinds of quantized inputs, and various kinds of garbled outputs. So in other words, I think there are many times that there are productive mistakes that are made and slips that are made, and you know, to use the old tired term of the glitch, that's still one way that we can gain unexpected things from the system. The other thing I would say is that we have to remember that humans themselves, even outside of any accidental or purposeful disruption, are very, very good at hacking. And that actually architects in specific are good at hacking. We hack our tools all the time. The very protocols that many architects use when they engage in sophisticated software protocols, for instance, are ones that they've devised as a way to overcome certain shortcomings of software, or to turn software to their own account, as opposed to the way that they were originally intended. And I love that culture. I think that culture is one that deserves fresh attention now as we investigate the kind of biases that are built into our protocols and into our softwares, and even sometimes into our hardwares. And I just welcome, I hope that all of you guys that are engaged in practice or are studying architecture find ways to hack the tools that you're asked to engage with.
We have another question. Two more questions. Oh, sorry. Nabatanita Sharma.
Yeah. Hi. Am I audible?
Yes.
Yeah. My question was like, what is AI at the junction of the past or the present and the future? Like, for instance, La Sagrada by Gaudí, in the documentary called The Mystery of Creation, where the architects and the engineers working had to say that they had a really, really tough time figuring out what actually Gaudí had in his mind when he was actually thinking about the structure. So basically, this comes to the fact that every individual has a very, very different way of conceiving the information. So like here, can AI play a very vital role and actually help the architects and not cause death of the architect? And actually, it brings me to the other question: what is AI at the junction of the past or the present and the future?
Can I just say one thing? That there is a talk that we recorded. It is already uploaded by Mark Barry, who of course was the architect, one of the architects. Yeah. Okay,
yeah, I've seen that.
Do you want to respond, Sanford or Marrikka?
Well, I like the fact that you're bringing temporality into it. Temporality is maybe something that we haven't discussed enough. I think sometimes the moments of greatest human innovation, with very, very surprising leaps and sinks occur when humans have to compare their own experience of temporality with radically different scales of time and duration, and put that into the context of architecture. So when you ask if AI is a disruption of the past or the present or the future, I guess we would have to say that the way that we define those terms is often really narrow and involves kind of units like years, months, semesters. If we think, in my opinion, I'm sure I'm in the minority here, and I'm also hesitating a bit because my own opinion here is probably colored by my relative ignorance of what's involved in AI. But I think AI is actually quite a narrow part of the range of disruptions that are available to us today. Certain forms of machine intelligence and platform building that would fall outside of AI proper might also be deeply disruptive and have already been disruptive, often in quite negative ways. And then, of course, architecture itself, I think, is disruptive and has the potential to be deeply disruptive. And there is a kind of architectural intelligence. I started to get at it a little bit when I was talking about Casey's work in the desert. There is a kind of architectural intelligence that goes beyond the incorporation of what we would think of in computation as AI. And of course, I would hope, the only disruption I'm interested in at this point in time is the disruption of the future that we want relative to the future that we're getting.
Okay, we've got two more questions lined up. Marina Rodriguez.
Thank you.
Rodriguez.
Thank you so much.
Marina, let's unmute Marina. I can't do it for some reason. Oh, hold on. Yes, Marina. Yeah. Hi.
Yeah. No. Hello. Hi. Sorry. No. One question to more than a question, a comment to introduce another point of view to the question of the artificial, or maybe more related with the idea of ecology and nature that we talked with Sanford before too. I wanted to make a comment about this Caroline Marchand book about this relation between the feminism and the ecology, how this idea, how Bacon and the domination of the nature is related with the domination of the man to the woman in a way. And I wanted to introduce to the Cyborg Manifesto that we didn't talk about this incredible writing of Donna Haraway, in which she says that the modern machines, in a way, the machines are alive and are dynamics, but we, the humans, are just static, in a way, watching how they are producing real change. So I wanted just to introduce that to the conversation, because I think it's something important too.
Yeah, in my opinion, it's a really welcome introduction. Thank you, Marina. And I couldn't agree more. Right, the what is narrowly defined as the patriarchy is also deeply invested in our relationships with technology and nature, as well as the historic subjugation of women. And when I go back and I read Donna Haraway's Cyborg Manifesto, which was so long ago, I still find it's such a compelling piece and has really stood the test of time. Some of her, she just recently put out, not too long ago, the last book I read by her was Keeping with the Trouble. I don't know if you read that or if other people in the audience have read that. I suppose I find almost a kind of softening of the position over time, of her position over time. I like the idea of kinship, but I am a little bit wary of how quickly a kind of a productively troubling term like oddkin got sucked into architecture, in Frida Kahlo's kind of little ensembles of various unexpected pieces of landscape and architecture. And so I think that the issue with Haraway's writing remains the kind of the beauty of it in a strange way, and the fact that it's very easily quickly metabolized into strangely impoverished architectural approximations.
We have two more questions. Arturo Fer Gutierrez, I can't see you to unmute you on your thing, but he has a question. I don't know if Chow can find him. And also Pritam Lenka. And Asham Hussain, Asham Hussain's been there for a while, actually. Maybe you go to Asham first. Asham?
Hello.
Yeah. Where are
Hello,
you?
can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm speaking from India. Yeah,
Okay.
hello. So during the course of these lectures, we have been witnessing several mentions of phenomenology in the context of AI. With Professor Kwinter tracing the trail of phenomenology in 50s and 60s the other day and stating its modern relevance. In Professor Antoine with his Heideggerian touches, accentuating the etchings in phenomenology, its meaningfulness in the discourse of materiality and matter, and also in the realm of inhabitation. Looking at the entire discourse from a Heideggerian spectacle and keeping in mind his theories of dwelling and inhabitation, of course, his abyssal extensions of the term dwelling and being in his seminal work, Building, Dwelling, and Thinking. What existential inquiries do you think this opens up for us in order to comprehend AI, to understand AI, automation, machine learning, all these things? Yeah, so that's it.
I'm not the
Neil,
person.
you seem like you're chomping at the bit. Would you like to say something?
Yeah, no, I wrote a book called Forget Heidegger, so I'm not the right person. It's also in Romanian, Heidegger, but so I'm not the person to answer that one at all.
Well, I've become very, so I agree, Arshan, phenomenology is back somehow. I used to feel very allergic toward it. I'm certainly not a fan of Heidegger. But at the same time, I think we have to find other ways of talking about our embodied experience in the world. And here again, the question of aesthetics, I think, comes to the forefront, because there are the way that we encounter other things in the world has a great deal to do with our embodied experience. There's a quote by Arnheim that Sanford knows I've been chewing on for a little while, where he's trying to talk about the distinction between shape and form, and shape is one of my ongoing research interests. And he makes this point that before we cognize something, before we assimilate it into our system of thinking, before we even so to speak, recognize it, we have this kind of uncoded or less coded recognition that it's approaching us as a friend or as an enemy. And he says, before you know what hits you, you know you are being hit. And so much of contemporary experience today is a kind of super cynical play on that basic truth of how we experience the world, and is designed to kind of punch you before you know what's punching you. That I think if we lose our interest in that reality, and if we lose our ability to engage architecture in that way, and AI within architecture in that way, the discipline will lose much of its relevance in the world. So I think it's really critical for us to kind of pay attention to our embodied experience and the way that we actually form kind of affiliations with what's around us.
Thank you.
I'm going to intervene very quickly. I know we only have a few minutes. I didn't get to do any of the stuff that I had originally planned on hallucination, et cetera, et cetera. So what I would like to do is simply state as quickly as possible as we depart a couple things. Number one, where it was going, and why, shall we say, to say this in a dramatic and slightly, theatrical sense, quote, why I am not interested in AI. I'm going to try and keep that to a single sentence. But I would like to say, first of all, this whole phenomenology thing is interesting. It can be very clearly and specifically delineated. It is not by any means confined to interest in Heideggerian thought. In fact, some of the most prominent shall we say, Heideggerians in the architecture world have no interest in that particular aspect, but it really has to do with not only the real founders of phenomenology, which might be interesting to go back to, but the French phenomenologists, and I include there not only Merleau-Ponty, who's enormously, I think, ripe for redeployment and rediscovery, but also people like Bachelard, and even, frankly, aspects of Simondon. But all this is to say that one of the most important avenues and justifications for a review and a reincorporation of some of the greater, more rigorous aspects of the phenomenological work of the mid 20th century and early 20th century is the insurgence, shall we say, into a topic of contemporary concern, which is the body. We see it everywhere and all over the place. Obviously, some of the older people here are aware of the fact that way back in the 1990s at Zone, the publishing company that I used to run, we committed so many of our resources, etc., to the body. That frankly is not what I'm talking about either. I mean, there are, of course, we can find the sources in there, specific, in some of that stuff. But I'd like to say that the reemergence of the body today it's a new chapter in these attempts to reassert the intelligence in the body, and my understanding of what my commitment to doing natural intelligence. When I made it early, a few weeks ago, I just knew that that's where I would have wished to go. I didn't go there. So my final statement is this: why I am not interested in AI, and that is precisely because it doesn't define what is important. It doesn't define the problem. It's actually just a very, very provincial, completely circumscribed area in the larger, and I think more constitutive problematic. So to say it in another way is this: I am far more interested these days in the laboratory that is approaching these problems from the point of view that is using virtual reality, shall we say, because that actually represents a massive deployment of resources and concepts, which include the body and problems of consciousness. And the problems of experience and the context of space and its relation and time in relation to the sensory system. I find that the problems are more directly, more concretely, and with far greater capacity to illuminate. They are being posed there. I find them more graspable. I find them more theorizable. And I feel like in a certain sense, they almost always trump these tiny little incremental discoveries that we make through experimentation with AI. I encourage all AI work and on all of you to continue, but I would say is the wider problems of perception, as I suggested, can be grasped through this, for example, when I gave the example of Gibson, what is it that Gibson discovered that was so critical to his renewed understanding of perception? Those are the things we need to better understand. And that's why, for me, to depart from any kind of an ecological framework today could be at our peril. That's it.
But I just very quickly, Arturo has a question. We haven't got a chance to ask, but I want Arturo to ask his question. Yes, Arturo?
So, according to what Professor Sanford said, there is no technology that doesn't transform the entire ecology of the world. What could be the transformations in part of the world, such as the Amazon rainforest, by the raising of the AI? Places where governments see them just like territories to extract raw material, and no more. Places where abstract economic demands matter more than people. What do you think about it?
Can I just say, we've got so little time. Can we just throw that question out there? I also want to get Danica to, who's also key up. We haven't got a chance to answer, but I think
I just want to ask that person who asked the question to please write me. Go ahead.
Yeah, okay.
Yes, okay.
Danica. Oh, sorry, Danica. Sorry, I'm trying to. There we go. Yeah.
Yeah.
Very
Can you
quickly.
hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. My question is just since I want to. I'm sorry. I'm a master's student. My master thesis is coming up, and I want to do something related to AI. So any literature, software, anything that could help me, or suggestions. Yeah, sorry.
Email me, right? Send me a message to me. I will communicate with you. I've got lots of stuff. I mean, book loads, shelf loads of stuff. That's it's out there. But you know,
thank you.
Yeah, we just want to say we've now reached the end, and I'm really keen for everyone to go and listen to Nada Tarani and Masham Sakis.